Hello everyone, welcome back to OpenGL. In this video I just wanted to touch up the shader code and just introduce some newer concepts that will allow us to simplify the amount of code that we have in our shader files, and this will also help us when we are working on finishing up the normal mapping, which will be the next video. So I just wanted to start off with a concept called interface blocks. And in essence, all it is just a structure that you explicitly pass only. The only purpose of the structure is to pass it between the vertex shader and the fragment shader, or the geometry shader. So it's just to pass it between the shader files. So in instance.vs, so in our vertex shader here, the way that we would do this is we have our three output variables now, but if we wanted to group them in a structure, what we could say is out, still denoting that we want to output it from the vertex shader, and then the structure name, which we can call vs underscore out in caps. I don't believe that is necessary. And then outside of the curly braces, we're going to have just the name, which I will do underscore vs lowercase vs out, and then in this structure we're gonna have the three values. So vec3 frag pose, vec3 normal, and vec2 text chord. So we're just putting the three variables and we're putting them in a structure so we can wrap it so it's more organized. And you can delete those, and then now in the main method, what we have to do is update where we assign the fragment position, the normal vector, and also the texture coordinate. So every instance of frag pose becomes vs underscore out dot frag pose, so the name of the structure here, and then you just copy and paste that, the tag there, so then it becomes vs underscore out dot normal there, and then when we calculate the GL position, we have to update how we access the fragment position using the structure, and then finally texture coordinate will also have to be updated, so it assigns to vs out. Alright, now in object.fs, we're gonna do this pretty much the same thing except for taking it in now. So find the three variables that you take in, the same three variables, and what we're gonna say is we're going to replace it with an in structure. So we're calling it in. The structure name has to be the same, so vs underscore out, and we will have the vec3 frag pose, the vec3 normal, and the vec2 text chord. And then we will call this fs underscore in. And now in here, it's a little trickier to replace all of them, just because we call it a bunch of times. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a control F, and then I will replace all instances of frag pose matching the case. So match case, and I will replace it with vs or fs underscore in dot frag pose, and that should replace all of them, I believe. Let me just make sure that it is doing this right. Yeah, so make sure that it does match the case, because otherwise it's gonna replace some values in the structure here, or in the shadow calculation method where we have frag pose light space. So make sure that it matches the case there. So I'm just gonna replace. All right, so that should be good there, and then we're gonna do something similar for the normal. So normal match case, this should be replaced with fs underscore in dot normal, and we're gonna replace those, and make sure that if it does replace it, just make sure that go through the instances that it replaced, and just if it missed something or did something incorrectly, then just replace that accordingly. So for example, in the Boolean uniform no normal map, it replaced normal with fs in dot normal, so I just had to revert it to the original. And then finally for text chord, same deal. Alright, so that's good there, and then I'm just going to run this to make sure that it all works. Ooh, this also. Alright, so just to make sure that everything was replaced properly, I'm going to do a Control F and then search fs_in dot. So just to make sure that it replaced all the actual instances of it. So for example, once again, we have this here. So skip normal mapping is a Boolean uniform, and it replaced it with the tag there. So I just want to revert it to the original. And just another warning, that if you do the find and replace, it will also replace the actual variables in the structure, so just make sure to remove the fs_in tag from them, so it just reads the type and then the variable. So in short, if it replaces it where it should not, just make sure you revert it to the original. Alright, so that's interface blocks. Let's go ahead and run this to make sure it works. And everything looks the same, make sure that it's all rendering properly. So yeah, that is interface blocks. Now I'm going to go into shader.cpp, and I'm going to do one quick change here in compile shader. This function here, if it prints out an error, I just wanted to add that it prints out the actual file so we can locate any errors within their respective files. So I'm just going to add the file path to the output here, so if there was any error, it would show, and it would show the file, so we would know where to look. Because as of now, it only shows the line numbers, and we would have to search the files to see which file it actually corresponded to. All right. The next two things that we're going to look at are going to be default values for a shader. So we'll start with something a little simple. It's going to be just a default shader directory. So it's going to be in the shader header file. I'm going to go to the bottom here. We're going to have static values here. So it's going to be the default directory containing all of the shader files, because in our main file, when we initialize all the shaders, we repeat assets/shaders several different times, and it kind of clutters up the code here. So just to simplify that, we can have a static std string default directory, and then in shader.cpp in load shader source, which is up here, I'm just going to we're going to create a full path. So standard string full path is equal to default shader : default directory plus a / character, and then plus file path. So the file path is relative to the default directory, and then when we call file.open, we will just replace that with full path.cstring, just like that. Okay, and then now in main.cpp, what we have to do is set that static variable. So in above the main method, we have to say standard string scene : default directory, or not scene, sorry, shader : default directory is equal to, and we will say assets/shaders, if that is correct. Assets/shaders, correct. Like so, and then in the actual when we initialize our shaders, we can just remove the string assets/shaders in the actual in the file path that we pass in. So there's going to be a bunch of those, and this will also apply for the shadow shaders that we have as well. Alright, good. So let's run this to make sure it all works. And we're looking good. Alright, perfect. Alright, the final topic I wanted to look at now was somewhat of a primitive include system for our shaders. So when we do the next video normal mapping, we're gonna see that the vertex shader will need access to the uniform light structures. Now, I'll talk more about why that is in that video, but if we wanted to copy and paste all of these light structures from fragment shader into the vertex shader, that would take up a lot of code. So another way to kind of do that is just to think about how we actually load in the shaders. So in our compile shader function, all we're doing is we're taking the shader source, which is a string. We're not passing in a file path. We take the string value, which contains the GLSL code directly, and we're passing it into OpenGL. So we could do whatever we want with that shader source in between loading it and passing it on to OpenGL. So we're going to have a default header, a very simplified model here. I don't want to have some sort of include detection where if the shader has something like an include #include and we'll say default.h. I don't want to go ahead and detect that because we would have to parse through the file, but also just because I mean, we could do that, but I just wanted to keep it simple for now and just have a system of default headers. But I definitely see the help of doing something like that. So we're going to first go into shader.h and we're going to create a few static functions here. Alright, so we'll start down here. We're going to have a stream containing the default header content. So it's going to be a static std string stream, and it's going to be called default headers. And then we're going to have a function to actually load a file into the default header. So load to default header. So static void load into default, and we will just pass in a const char star file path. And then we also want to have a method to clear the default. So after we compile the shaders, so static void clear default. And then finally I'm going to take the load shader source function here, and I'm just going to paste it down below, and I will add the static tag to it. So it should read static std string load shader source, and then the same parameters. Alright, so we're going to go into the shader source file, and in the static function section, we're going to initialize the variable here, the string stream that we will use to hold the values. And it's going to be initializing like any other static variable. So standard string stream, then the class tag, so shader, then : default headers, and we don't need to call any constructor here because it's implicitly called. What we're going to do is I'm going to copy and paste all the function definitions, or the function signatures. I'm going to paste them down below. And I also want to take the load shader source and put that down with the other static methods as well, just to keep everything organized. Just like so. Now for load into default, all we're going to do is we're going to get the file contents, so standard string file contents is equal to load shader source. Or we first have to add the shader class tag here. So load shader source and pass in the file path, which is just the file path that we pass in to the function, and then we can simply append it to the stream. So shader : default headers, the string stream, and then we're going to use the left shift operator, which isn't left shift here, it's just the input operator. And we're going to say file contents. So all we're doing is we're just taking the header and we are just putting it in here. And this, since this is so simplified, it's gonna take a little. We're gonna have to have some specifications about that default header. But before we do that, just for the clear default, it's simply going to be shader : default headers dot clear. And then make sure to remove the static tag from the function definitions. Alright, so now that we have these functions, I also want to go back into shader.h, and we're going to add some parameters to our constructors here. So in the constructor, we're going to have a boolean here value. So bool include default header, and this will just determine whether or not we actually want to use the default header. Because, for example, we're going to mainly just be using this for the light structures now, but we don't want to have those in the shadow shaders because they're not necessary, so we don't need to include that there. So that's a parameter for the constructor. Then I also want to have the same parameter in generate. So generate, and then along with compile shader, and then load shader source, so the new static function. All right, and then we're going to go into shader.cpp and add that parameter into the corresponding functions, into the signatures right now. So compile shader, and then load shader source. All right, now we actually have to go through all the calls to these internal functions and add those parameters too. So from the constructor, when we call generate, just pass an include default header to the parameter list. And then in generate, when we call compile shader all 3 times, we have to pass in the include default header parameter as well. And then in compile shader, when we call load shader source, we have to paste in the parameter as well. And then in load shader source, or in load into default, we're just going to pass in false because we don't want to get the source of the existing default headers and append that to the new default file. All right, now in load shader source, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to determine if we want to actually use the default header. So include default. So if include default header, we're just going to append it to the stream. So buff, and then the left shift operator shader : default headers dot str. So we're just getting the string value of the stream, and we're appending it to the buffer. And all it does is it will load it in before the other files. Okay, now in main.cpp we have to add the parameters to the constructor of the shaders, and then we also have to tell the compiler which files to load in as a default header. So before we actually call the constructors on the shaders, I'm going to say shader : load into default, and we're going to pass in a file called default head.gh. That's just an arbitrary extension, and we're going to create that file in a second. Now for the shader, the constructors that we're going to pass true in is going to be for the default shader, so the one that we use to render our objects, and then false for the box shader and for the shadow shaders. And then once we actually once we call the shader constructors, we can then free the default because we don't need it anymore. So shader : clear default. Now for the actual default header, I'm going to go into the shaders folder, and I'm going to add a new item, and I'm going to just select, it doesn't matter which type because we're going to customize the extension to fit the name. So we called it default head.gh. Now in default head.gh, what we want to do is we have to first have the hashtag version 330 core. This is necessary. The reason why is because the first part of any GLSL piece of code, the source, the first line has to be the version comment there, or the version specification there. But because we're appending it at the beginning, this header has to have that version specification at the top of the file. So we're going to take this, and that's going to be the top. And now in object.fs, we're going to delete that version, because it cannot be specified twice. It can only be specified once. And then we're going to take all these structures here, the Duralite, and paste it in. So cut and paste each of the structures from object.fs into default head.gh. And then spotlight. Just like so. And then, as with the fragment shader, we have to delete the version specification from the vertex shader as well. So just cut those lines out there. Alright, so what will happen now is these three structures along with the version specification will be loaded in as a default header. They will be put into the string stream, and then when we actually compile the other shaders, it will be the default source will be appended in before the other source code. Alright, so now let's go ahead and run this, and we still see that everything works properly. And if we were to print out the header source, or the source that we were passing into OpenGL, it would seem as if the file got copied and pasted over into both the vertex and the fragment shader. So yeah, that's just a bit of a few things that I wanted to talk about with this shader. We will be using these when we're finishing up the normal mapping, which will be next week. So until then, study up. Maybe, I don't know, you don't really have to, but I'll see you then. Have a good one.